The disappearance of Madeleine McCann took place on May 3, 2007, in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Madeleine, a 3-year-old British child, vanished from her family's holiday apartment while her parents, Kate McCann and Jerry McCann, were dining nearby with friends. Despite extensive investigations by Portuguese, British, and later German authorities, the case remains unsolved. A German suspect, Christian Brueckner, was identified in 2020, but no charges have been finalized in connection to Madeleine's disappearance. There are nights that begin like any other, quiet, predictable, almost forgettable. And then there are nights that leave behind a silence so heavy, it echoes for years. A child is tucked into bed, the lights are turned off, and everything feels safe. But in the span of a single evening, that sense of safety disappears. And what remains is a question no one has ever been able to fully answer. In early May 2007, a British family arrived in Praia da Luz, a seaside resort town in southern Portugal known for its calm atmosphere and family-friendly environment. Among them was 3-year-old Madeleine McCann, a young girl with distinctive features, blonde hair, bright eyes, and a small mark in her right eye that would later become one of the most recognized identifiers in missing person history. She was traveling with her parents, Kate McCann and Jerry McCann, along with her 2-year-old twin siblings. The family was part of a larger group of friends, all staying in the same holiday complex. Their routine quickly became consistent. Each evening, after putting their children to bed, the adults would gather at a nearby tapas restaurant within the resort. The distance between the apartments and the restaurant was relatively short, estimated at around 50 to 60 meters, and the group maintained that they checked on the children at regular intervals throughout the night. At first glance, it seemed like a controlled system. One adult would leave the table, walk back to the apartments, ensure everything was fine, and return. Then another would do the same. It was a pattern they had followed for several nights without any issue. But what felt safe in theory would later become one of the most scrutinized decisions in modern true crime history. On the evening of May 3rd, the day had passed like any other holiday. There was nothing outwardly unusual. The children played, the adults socialized, and as night approached, the familiar routine began again. Around 7:00 p.m., Madeleine and her siblings were put to bed inside their ground-floor apartment. The parents then left to join their friends for dinner. As the evening unfolded, the group followed their usual system of checks. At approximately 9:00 p.m., Jerry McCann reportedly entered the apartment to check on the children. He later stated that he saw Madeleine asleep in her bed and noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The door was left as it had been, and he returned to the restaurant. Roughly an hour later, at around 10:00 p.m., Kate McCann went to perform her check. What she encountered in that moment would immediately signal that something was wrong, but the full reality would take seconds longer to set in. The bedroom door was more open than expected. The window appeared to be open and the shutters were raised. Inside, the twins were still asleep, undisturbed, but Madeleine's bed was empty. There was no immediate sign of forced entry, no clear indication of a struggle. No noise had been reported by anyone nearby. In a place designed for relaxation and safety, a child had vanished without waking the others in the room. Within moments, panic spread. Kate McCann rushed back to the restaurant, alerting the group. Staff members and guests began searching the surrounding area, calling Madeleine's name into the night. Atmosphere shifted from calm to chaotic in minutes. What had been a routine holiday evening was now the beginning of an international missing persons case. Local authorities were contacted, and the Portuguese police initiated their response. Initial searches focused on the immediate area, nearby streets, buildings, and open spaces. But as the hours passed, one critical issue became apparent. There was no clear direction, no confirmed sighting, no physical trail that could guide investigators toward an answer. And yet, even in those early hours, one detail stood out: the timeline. Because if Madeleine had been seen asleep at around 9:00 p.m. and discovered missing at approximately 10:00 p.m., then whatever happened within that narrow window of time. A gap of less than an hour. A moment when multiple people were nearby, yet no one reported seeing or hearing anything definitive. That window would later become one of the most analyzed aspects of the entire case. As the night continued, search efforts intensified. Police officers expanded their perimeter. Roads were monitored. Vehicles were checked. But the absence of immediate evidence began to raise deeper questions. If this was an abduction, it had been carried out with a level of speed and silence that suggested either planning or opportunity. By the early hours of the morning, it was clear that this was no longer a local incident. The scale of the situation was growing, and as daylight approached, the case of Madeleine McCann was about to capture the attention of not just Portugal, but the entire world. But even as the search expanded, one unsettling truth remained unchanged. No one knew exactly what had happened inside that apartment, and more importantly, no one knew who had taken her, or how. As the first light of morning broke over Praia da Luz, the urgency of the situation became impossible to ignore. What had started as a frantic overnight search was now a full-scale missing child investigation. Police officers, resort staff, and volunteers moved methodically through the area, combing through streets, alleyways, and nearby properties. But despite the growing number of people involved, one critical element was still missing: evidence. There were no clear footprints, no discarded items, no immediate signs pointing to where Madeleine McCann had gone. In those early hours, the working assumption leaned heavily toward abduction. The ground-floor apartment, accessible from the outside, and the routine of leaving children unattended, even for short intervals, created a scenario investigators could not ignore. If someone had been watching the group's habits, they would have known exactly when the apartment was vulnerable. But this theory came with its own set of problems. No one had reported suspicious activity that clearly aligned with the narrow timeline. No confirmed witness could place a suspect inside or directly outside the apartment at the exact moment Madeleine disappeared. As the investigation intensified, Portuguese police, known as the Polícia Judiciária, began formal procedures. Statements were taken from the McCanns and their friends, timelines were reconstructed, and the apartment became the focal point of forensic analysis. Specialists examined the bedroom, the window, the door, and the surrounding environment. But the results were far from definitive. There was no clear forensic trail indicating forced entry, and no physical evidence that could conclusively confirm an abduction had taken place. Despite this, reports of possible sightings began to surface. One of the most discussed involved a man seen carrying a young child in the vicinity around the time Madeleine disappeared. This sighting, later widely reported, described a figure moving away from the area, holding what appeared to be a sleeping child. However, investigators were never able to conclusively verify this individual's identity or confirm that the child was Madeleine. Over time, multiple reconstructions and appeals were made based on this account, but it remained uncertain, another piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit cleanly. As days passed, the scale of the search expanded beyond the immediate resort. Borders were alerted. Airports and ports were notified. The case quickly drew international attention, with British authorities stepping in to support the Portuguese investigation. Media coverage intensified rapidly, transforming the disappearance into one of the most high-profile missing person cases in modern history. Madeleine's image spread across continents, and the pressure on investigators increased with each passing day. But with that pressure came complications. As the investigation continued, inconsistencies, whether real or perceived, began to emerge in the statements given by those closest to the case. Portuguese authorities scrutinized timelines, re-examined witness accounts, and attempted to identify any discrepancies that could explain the lack of physical evidence. This phase of the investigation marked a subtle but significant shift. The focus was no longer solely on an unknown intruder. Questions were beginning to be asked about the events inside the apartment itself. Forensic teams brought in specialized sniffer dogs trained to detect cadaver scent and traces of blood. According to reports at the time, these dogs indicated the presence of such scents in certain areas associated with the apartment and items connected to the family. However, it is critical to understand that these indications were not supported by conclusive laboratory evidence. No definitive forensic proof was established that a death had occurred in the apartment. Still, these findings added a layer of complexity and controversy to the investigation. As scrutiny intensified, the spotlight turned directly onto Kate McCann and Jerry McCann. In September 2007, both were formally named arguidos, a legal term in Portuguese law indicating they were official suspects. This development shocked the public and marked a turning point in how the case was perceived. For months, they had been seen as parents desperately searching for their missing child. Now, they were being investigated as part of the case itself. The decision was based on a combination of factors, including the forensic alerts, analysis of statements, and investigative interpretations. However, no charges were filed. The evidence did not meet the threshold required for prosecution. And over time, criticism grew regarding how the investigation had been handled, particularly concerning the interpretation of forensic findings and the direction of the inquiry. By 2008, the Portuguese Attorney General made a critical decision. The case was officially archived due to a lack of sufficient evidence. The arguido status of both parents was lifted, and they were no longer considered suspects. However, the case itself remained unsolved, leaving behind unanswered questions and a deeply divided public opinion. For some, this moment reinforced the belief that the investigation had taken a wrong turn, focusing too heavily on the family without conclusive proof. For others, it highlighted the possibility that key evidence had been missed or misinterpreted in the crucial early stages. Either way, the result was the same. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann remained a mystery. Yet even as official progress stalled, the case refused to disappear. Because beyond the legal decisions, beyond the forensic debates, and beyond the shifting theories, one fact remained unchanged. A child had vanished within a tightly confined window of time in a place where multiple adults were nearby. And despite everything that followed, no one could say with certainty what had actually happened during those missing minutes. That uncertainty would go on to define the case and set the stage for a new phase of investigation that would begin years later, far beyond the borders of Portugal. For several years after the case was archived in 2008, it seemed as though momentum had faded. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann remained unsolved, suspended in a space between public memory and unanswered questions. But behind the scenes, pressure never truly disappeared. In the United Kingdom, calls for a renewed investigation continued to grow, driven by both public demand and the belief that critical opportunities may have been missed in the early stages. In 2011, that pressure led to a major turning point. The Metropolitan Police launched a formal review known as Operation Grange, an independent investigation designed to re-examine every detail of the case from the beginning. Unlike the original inquiry, this approach focused on a complete reconstruction of timelines, movements, and witness accounts, treating the case as if it were being investigated for the first time. Detectives analyzed thousands of documents, statements, and pieces of evidence, looking for inconsistencies, overlooked leads, and new connections. What they found was not a single definitive answer, but a pattern of gaps. Investigators identified discrepancies in the original timeline, particularly regarding who had checked on the children and when. These inconsistencies did not prove what had happened, but they highlighted how fragile the sequence of events really was. If even small details in the timeline were uncertain, then the entire understanding of that night could be incomplete. And if the timeline was incomplete, then so was the investigation. In 2013, British police released updated suspect sketches based on revised witness statements. One of the key reconstructions involved a man seen carrying a child near the resort on the night Madeleine disappeared. This new appeal reignited public attention and led to fresh tips from across Europe. However, despite the renewed focus, no confirmed identification was made. Once again, the case expanded, but without a clear resolution. Years passed and the investigation continued quietly in the background. Resources were allocated, leads were followed, and authorities maintained that the case was still active. But for many observers, the lack of visible progress raised a difficult question. Was the truth simply out of reach? Then, in 2020, more than a decade after the disappearance, a new name emerged publicly. German prosecutors identified Christian Brueckner as a suspect in the case. He was a German national with a criminal history that included sexual offenses, burglary, and drug-related crimes. Crucially, he had lived in the Algarve region of Portugal around the time Madeleine disappeared. This development marked one of the most significant shifts in the entire investigation. Authorities revealed that Brueckner had access to a vehicle, had been in the vicinity of Praia da Luz, and had allegedly discussed crimes involving children in the past. They also confirmed that he had received a phone call near the area on the night Madeleine vanished. These elements placed him within the broader context of the case, but they did not yet establish a complete or provable sequence of events. Perhaps the most striking statement came from German prosecutors, who publicly declared that they believed Madeleine McCann was dead. However, it is critical to understand that this assertion was based on evidence that has not been fully disclosed to the public. No body has ever been found. No definitive forensic link has been released. And as of now, Christian Brueckner has not been formally charged in connection with Madeleine's disappearance. This created a new kind of tension, one rooted not in absence, but in partial revelation. Because for the first time in years, investigators were expressing a level of certainty about the outcome, without revealing the full evidence behind it. And that left both the public and the media in a familiar position, searching for answers in a case that continues to withhold them. In the years that followed, searches were conducted in Portugal based on intelligence linked to Brueckner. Authorities examined wells, properties, and remote areas, attempting to locate any physical evidence that could confirm their theory. Despite these efforts, no publicly confirmed breakthrough has been announced that conclusively resolves the case. And so, nearly 2 decades after that night, the central mystery remains. What happened inside that apartment between approximately 9:00 p.m. and 10:00 p.m.? Was it a targeted abduction by someone who had observed the family's routine? Was it a crime of opportunity carried out in a brief but critical window of time? Or is there a piece of evidence, still undiscovered, that could finally connect the fragments of this story into a complete picture? The truth is, despite international investigations, millions spent, and one of the most extensive media campaigns in missing person history, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains officially unsolved. But what makes this case endure is not just the mystery, it's the uncertainty. Because every major development has brought new questions along with it. Every lead has opened another possibility, rather than closing the case. And every year that passes adds distance from the moment when answers might have been easiest to find. Yet the investigation has never fully stopped. Authorities in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Portugal continue to treat the case as active. And as long as it remains open, the possibility, however small, still exists that one day a definitive answer will emerge. Until then, the story of that night in Praia da Luz remains incomplete. A child went asleep and was never seen again, and somewhere between what is known and what has never been proven lies the truth.